All right, thank you everybody for joining us on this Tuesday. I had to think for a second what today was. So this is our second annual IPR Disinformation in Society report. It's one of the few studies IPR does that looks at a general audience rather than specifically PR practitioners. We did see increases of that with COVID, with some of our COVID reports. But what we wanted to focus on with this, and it was a charge from our great IPR Board of Trustees, is to specifically look at fake news and how fake news impacts our society. And that's how the Disinformation in Society report. And what we focus on is how Americans perceive intentionally misleading news or information. So let's dive right into it. So the methodology for this is we partner with Morning Consult, and we did a survey of 2,200 adults in March. Around this time in March, COVID was really taking off. It was already declared a pandemic. A lot of people were starting to stay home, so it was well on its way. And with that size audience, it's a plus or 2% margin of error. And what we did is we asked them similar questions to what we had last year so we can compare to see what has happened. But we looked at what is the prevalence of disinformation in the US, the parties most responsible for sharing disinformation, the level of trust, and whose job it is to combat disinformation. Hold on, a couple people raised their hand. I'm not sure if there's any issues, Nikki, but I'm sure if there are that you will let me know or someone can text me. But what we also did different this year compared to last year is why people do or do not share certain content on social media, their media consumption habits, and the perceived impact of disinformation on society. So what we specifically wanted to see is how people thought that would affect the election and other sorts of things. So just to clarify, we specifically use the term disinformation and not fake news. And the reason why we do that is to give it more of an academic sense, but also disinformation is used to define information that people may not agree with. You see frequently in the media, or what people will say on Twitter is that's fake news, when it's not actually fake news, it's just that they don't agree with it and it's actual news or information. So we use the term disinformation. Now, you may hear disinformation and misinformation used interchangeably, but it's not the same thing. They're very different. Disinformation is deliberately misleading or biased information. It's on the part of the sender who is trying to harm or create some sort of negative change in somewhere else. Whereas misinformation is just misleading information or false information. It's not sort of ill will on the part of the sender who's trying to deceive people in the process. So this is what the difference is with disinformation. I also want to thank our two sponsors of this project that helped fund the research, and that's the Public Affairs Council. And Doug Pinkham, who's the president, is on our board, and he was very helpful with the study. And then AFLAC, and Catherine Hernandez-Blades is on our board, and she helped fund the study. All right, let's get into it and see what the results are. So the first question that we ask is sort of a baseline to see what are the top issues facing Americans, and they determine if it's a major problem, minor problem, or not a problem. And what we saw this year is that the two biggest concerns, not surprisingly, infectious disease outbreaks was number one at 74%. I think that number probably would be much higher today, but this was in March and there was still some debate about the effects of the virus, and there's still some debates today. But then healthcare cost was also up there at 72%. And you can see that, the arrows that are going through it, that says what changes were from year over year. So healthcare costs declined 8%. Now note that it is 8%, not 8 percentage points. So it's a very slight decline from last year. Now, if you notice in the highlighted in yellow is misinformation and disinformation. So more than half of Americans saw disinformation and misinformation as major problems in the US, but the public's overall level of concern declined from 2019 to today. 61% are concerned about misinformation. Last year, that number was at 65%. And then 58% were concerned about disinformation this year, and that was from 63% from last year. But if you look at where they fall in between the other sort of major problems in society, they're still really high. They're higher than illegal drug use and crime, which come in at 55%, and even higher than gun violence, which is at 54%. And misinformation was higher than the economy. Okay. All right, so I just want to clarify, just for I see there's some academics on the call, because they're probably thinking, well, how did you distinguish between misinformation and disinformation? Is we did give a definition in parentheses next to the misinformation and disinformation so that people could tell specifically what it is. Because there is, if you ask one person what they think misinformation is, you would have a different answer from somebody else. So we did establish some baseline with a specific definition. So then pulling out of that, we asked this specific question: do Americans believe that false news or disinformation is a problem in the US? And we just said that very clear. In the previous one, we had sort of a laundry list. And so 84% agree to some extent that false news or different information is a problem in the US. I mean, that's really significant. That's a vast majority. And then 9% said no, and then 8% weren't sure. We also asked a question about, and this is new to this year compared to last year, is what is the impact of disinformation on our society? So what we did is we gave them a Likert scale that said statement whether they strongly agree or disagree, whether disinformation is a threat to our democracy. And nearly 3/4 of respondents said, yes, it is a threat to our democracy. And then 69%, so nearly 7 out of 10 respondents, said they do believe that it undermines the election process. It would probably be really interesting after the election to see what degree people believed that disinformation played a role in the process, especially based on what we saw in 2016. But that will have to wait till March when we do our third iteration of the study. So then, of course, we ask is what people believe are the most trustworthy sources of information. And we give about 32 sources, and we ask people to rate them in terms of their levels of trust. So for the second year in a row, Americans view their family as the most trustworthy source for news and information. Other top sources are local broadcast news, People Like Me, and federal agencies such as the CDC and the FDA. Now, why there is an asterisk next to the federal agencies is because that's something new that we added this year. Regarding professions, and this isn't necessarily reflected on what you see on the screen, we wanted, so we have like other professions like journalists and so on. But for professions, respondents have at least some trust in journalists. That was from 45% of respondents. And then public relations professionals, Americans, only 26% of Americans had some trust in PR professionals, 21% in CEOs, and marketers and advertisers were only 13%. Colleges and universities were viewed as trustworthy by 39%, and then 29% consider major companies trustworthy. One of the interesting parts that I just want to digress on a little is what that means with sort of trustworthy sources. And so if you look at the next slide, we look at the impact of political affiliation on trust. So where do people, if they're Republicans or Democrats, and we have independents, but they weren't drastically as different or polarized as Republicans and Democrats, and what they perceive to be the level of trustworthiness of sources. So if you look at the right side of the screen, this is where Democrats sit, and then Republicans are on the right side of the screen. So if you go up here, and this somewhat trustworthy source of information, so if you go here, this means that fewer than 20% of Democrats have some trust in President Trump, whereas Republicans, you're in the top 80% that have some trust in Trump. So what we did differently this year is we also plotted some individuals. So you can see Joe Biden is down here. Now this was in March, so you can see how, today would probably be different. But what you notice is where people come together, right? That you have the local TV news and local newspapers are viewed as probably the most trustworthy sources from both sides. Whereas what you would expect, right, some of the more, well, we say liberal publications, the New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, those have at least a 25 to 35 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans. And even you see journalists, that Democrats are more likely than Republicans to trust journalists. That's a 36 percentage point gap. And same thing with colleges and universities. Republicans are more likely than Democrats to trust business CEOs. and the US government by 25 percentage points. But the one thing that is really fascinating is where they come together. And the local news sources is really critical because overall 70% have at least some trust in local broadcast TV news and 60% trust newspapers. But what we see reflected in society is really different. There's a professor at UNC, her name's Dr. Penelope Muse Abernathy, and she studies news deserts. And news deserts are places where there is not a local newspaper, or they have to rely on other newspapers. So she has calculated that since 2004, the US has lost 2,100 newspapers, leaving at least 1,800 communities that had a local news outlets without one. And that is called a news desert. And counter to that is what we also see called ghost newspapers. And ghost newspapers are the newspapers in some of these local outlets that are so thin that they're really devoid of a lot of news. And there's actually there's a Sustainability Act right now in Congress that looks to help support local newspapers. And that's part of that is brought on by COVID, but there was the Seattle Times editor had an article or had a page in the Seattle Times the Sunday before last, and he gave a statistic that of the top 50 regional metro newspapers, that 84% are no longer locally owned. So you can see where it's a very trusted source for both sides of the fence, but there's been a huge impact to journalism and local newspapers that I think is probably worthy of another look. That would have to be outside the scope of this webinar, of course, because we only have less than an hour. All right, so we also wanted to find out what were the sources responsible for spreading disinformation to the public. And 70% believe that Facebook and politicians are at least somewhat responsible for spreading disinformation to the public, more so than fake social media accounts. And so this is responsible, the header over there that says should be very responsible for combating disinformation, that is the wrong header. That should be responsible for spreading disinformation to the public. So along with Facebook and Twitter, YouTube or other social media platforms deemed at least somewhat responsible by half of the respondents for spreading disinformation. Then we wanted to know who is responsible for combating disinformation, and the government entities were seen as being most responsible for combating disinformation. President Trump was at the top of the list, along with US government, Congress, federal agencies. They were clocking in around 60%. And then following that were journalists and news outlets. You can see the cable news and newspaper. What I will say though, is that, of the list that we gave, the 32 sources that we gave, at least 25% of all our respondents said every information source was very responsible for combating disinformation. So when people point fingers and should be this person, it really is all of us that are responsible for helping to combat disinformation, according to the Americans that we surveyed. The source considered least responsible for combating disinformation is my employer. So we did add that for this year. There were a couple of people ask questions, and I'll just ask. And was my employer a source that was polled? Michelle asked that question, and yes, they were. So for all of the different sections that were, whether it's combating, spreading, we had the same sort of list, and my employer was one of them. They just weren't big enough or significant enough to really show up on all the list, as far as like the top. Here's the top 20 or whatever. Now in the full report, you can see where people fall and more information. And if anyone has questions, if you're like, where's my employer through each of the cycles, I'm more than happy. You can email me at tina@Institute for PR, and I'm more than happy to send you that information. So Jim asked about what do you make of the 20-something% trust in PR? Overall, businesses, CEOs. Now one thing is we gave this very general, and we didn't say a specific CEO. We just said CEOs, businesses, and then people gave responses. there's a couple reasons why I think that PR showed up there. PR was, people had more or some trust compared to others, but it's not great, right? So if you have like 26% who say that PR is at least somewhat trustworthy, there's a couple reasons for that. I think in our, there's some bad apples out there in PR, or people in PR who do, I mean, spread disinformation. I mean, you'd even see it in, you know, some of the press secretaries that we've had through this administration. And I think also, as we know, we're asking Americans about their perception of PR professionals. And I personally don't think that they understand what PR professionals do. If you watch TV and if you watch any sort of shows, they're perceived as people who fly in, not necessarily ethical in what they do on a day-to-day basis. And they go in and they sort of solve issues and right? And you have scandals, Sex in the City. So I think that doesn't help as well. And there's some great researchers out there in the academic space who are doing research looking at the perception of PR overall. Miles, there's also, Miles asked a question about where do think tanks and advocacy nonprofits fall in. And I would say, I mean, when you talk about nonprofits, and I think people forget that PR professionals work at nonprofits, they just think they're there sort of pushing that across. Oh, I just completely lost my train of thought. But yes, I think they would be more trusted sources than others. Hold on, let's see. Okay, so Alan, hold that thought. I'm going to talk about it in just a second with the slide. But if you look at where people are and who's doing a good job at, or so here's who should combat disinformation. The next question we asked was who is doing a good job at combating disinformation. So people like me, federal agencies and local broadcast TV news were ranked the highest in combating disinformation. But as Alan pointed out, and he said, is that right that 1/4 of all respondents have some trust and half believe that PR people should be very responsible? Yes, and that's not just PR, it's really all of them. There's a big gap that exists between who Americans think should be most responsible for combating disinformation and the perceived performance of those individuals and groups who are actually doing it. So for example, 63% said President Trump should be very responsible for combating disinformation, but only 19% said he was doing very well at combating it. And similar gaps were found with all the entities who score the highest in responsibility for combating disinformation and how well they're doing it. The US government was 62% versus 10%. Congress was 61% versus 7%. And journalists was 61% versus 11%. What you're seeing on screen are people who are doing somewhat well, but I'm talking specifically about the very wells. And federal agencies were 61% versus 17%. So, and it's like that throughout. I think, you know, I think overall it's really interesting to me because when we look at the major problems, right, you see like healthcare cost and gun violence and funding Social Security. Those have very tangible actions that can be taken. And I know there's different disagreements on policy, but there are specific things you can do. But disinformation, misinformation, unless you're an advocacy organization or a media literacy organization or that does training, a lot of companies don't necessarily wade into the water of this, or even government, you know, besides asking some of the Facebooks or Twitter to take more action, which, you know, that's a whole nother sort of discussion that we can talk about. But it's sort of everyone's sort of relying on others to do those things. I think, so I'm looking at Williams between should and are two different things. I don't think I'm following. Maybe if you could clarify, I'm more than happy to answer that. Yeah, so Craig asked a question. Sorry, I was reading the question. I wasn't dozing. Craig asked, since the top answer to 5 is who should be responsible is us, the people like me. We also ask, thanks, William. We also ask people not like me, and people not like me weren't necessarily as high as the people like me. So Craig asks, who should be responsible, us the people? Do you ever see a time where we might actually see the subject included in educational curriculum, and can it be ever done without people learning to bias, game, or manipulate practices? So that's a great question. I would say in colleges, especially today in communication programs, there are some really great classes that people take that do address this. It could be even like an intro to mass comm class, mass media effects, comm theory. And there's also specific media literacy classes. When I was at Cal Poly, you could actually get a minor in media literacy. There's also what we call, there's a couple of sort of, I think, theories that also work here. And we haven't tested this, but I think it would be really neat to test it. One of the theories is called third person effects, and we see it with the media. And what that means is that I don't think that I'm as affected by the media as other people. And I would say that, and there's also another effect called the better than average effect, where people think that they do better at something than the average. And Melissa just said third person effects would be, hi Melissa, would be applicable here. So perfect, we were both on the same page. There's also another great theory called better than average effects. And what that means is that I think I'm better than average. So if I say I'm a great driver, but the average person isn't a great driver, that's sort of also the better than average effect that, that we see crop up time and time again. And, you know, I will say from my experience at colleges and universities, they do a really good job teaching and just critical consumers of information in general. But I don't know what the prevalence is of that in secondary institutions, or even, you know, how people take advantage of that. What I would assume is that people think that they're less affected by disinformation, they're more able to discern disinformation, and that they have a better than average ability to process information. Okay, so let's, we'll keep going through. Okay, so the exposure to disinformation and news and media. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything on the last one. All right, so we asked people, and so nearly 3 out of 4 respondents, or 74%, report seeing news or information that misreality reality or is false at least once a week. And nearly half see it every day or almost every day. Now, to also just emphasize that whether people actually recognize that that's they're saying their ability to recognize it. I want to do a shameless plug for the IPR research letter. If you're not getting the IPR research letter, number one, excuse me, you should be. We're really tackling a lot of the misinformation components and the research on misinformation. And a lot of that comes out of our Behavioral Insights Research Center, which Dr. Terry Flynn from McMaster University leads. In fact, there's a couple of great misinformation research summaries that are coming out tomorrow, and it talks about you know, people's ability to discern misinformation and what they perceive as misinformation, and also how to combat it. So, you know, how does inoculation, meaning that you present information that is factual before the misinformation comes, how well it does to protect against misinformation. But if you go even to our Institute for PR website, and if you go to our under research tab and under the research library, we have some great, and also the Burke Center, we have some really great resources for misinformation and disinformation, especially as we're gearing up to the election. We're already seeing some of that out there. All right, so this is also the as Melissa talked about, third person effects, or even the better than average effect, is that we asked people about their confidence to sort of recognize information, and overall Americans continue to be very confident in their ability to recognize information that misrepresents reality or is false. 4 in 5 Americans, so you know, it was 77%, feel at least somewhat confident in their ability to recognize news or information, while 12% said they're not very confident, so very low numbers. And then also a growing number of people are not going to other sources to verify information. Compared to 2019, the number of Americans who said they often or always go to other websites fell from 47% in 2019 to 40% in 2020. And from my perspective, this may even be a little bit about the I would say the sort of social desirability effect. And I'm not doubting the research or trying, but you know, to think that 13% said they always go to other sources to verify, and then you're going 40% that always or often, that could be, you know, whether people actually do or not and what they consider to be the information. So there's a lot you could definitely dig into, but 30% sometimes go to other sources, while 20% rarely or never check alternative sources. I see Terry Flynn, our director of Burke, is on here. So he included the, if you look in the Q&A, he included a link to the research. I think you all can see that. Let's see. Okay, just to stop and take a question really quick. Are podcasts perceived as good or bad at combating this disinformation? I think it really just depends on the podcast. I think some podcasts are absolutely fantastic. And so I think if I was going to evaluate what makes a good podcast for disinformation, misinformation, is sort of listening to it, it would be whether people discern facts from opinion. So I'm a huge, there's specific podcast I listen to. I love Freakonomics is my favorite podcast out there. And it's Stephen Dubner, and he wrote the book Freakonomics, but it's all about behavioral economics and behavioral science. And it's like literally my favorite podcast. And so what he does when he gives research is he's always sort of telling the study or deep dives into it, or talks about the actual academics and sort of gives a background and knowledge, versus a podcast that I would give, right? Not I would give, but if I was giving a podcast, I'm like, yeah, you know, there's a lot of disinformation spread out there without giving that sort of research context. I think it's problematic. So it's a matter of listening to whether people are actually giving citations for sources and whether they're good citations for sources, right? If someone said that they're, not to get political, but if their research citation was Breitbart, right, that would be very different than Pew Research Center. So I think it's that sort of making sure that you're discerning where it's coming from and the sources, and also thinking, and there's some great guides. I think Washington Post had some guides for how to spot deep fakes. That was actually published in our I think we had top 14 research insights this year, which is on our signature studies page. So we included actually NYU, Washington Post had a few really good fact checkers and how you can spot fake news and misinformation. I hope I don't get this wrong. It's like top 10 ways to studies. You can go to our signature studies, and that has really great guidelines for how to spot misinformation. And Sarah Kochar, who's our previous director of research, also has a really great about 5 ways to spot fake research. So yes, let's see. So Alan Kelly, hi Alan, said that the stat that half of Americans think they can spot disinformation, misinformation is remarkable. They're especially blind to the moves and motives of PR practitioners. Alan and I are just going to have to disagree on that. Alan, I would agree with Alan that PR is responsible for some of the disinformation and misinformation is spread. I think it's a very small piece compared to some other agencies, but Alan, you and I will just have to disagree. All right, so we also asked a question of, in the past week, what has been your primary source of news, just to sort of gauge what their patterns of consumption are. And you can see that television is primary here, and the news websites and social media is 11%. We also added news alerts on our phone, but that wasn't as significant as I thought it would be, because I feel like a lot of people probably would get their news, but that wasn't actually the case. So we also asked, last year we did ask questions of just general news consumption, but what we added this year, and this was thanks to Doug Pinkham, great suggestion, was looking at sort of the behaviors around sharing of news and information. So we asked the question, how often do you share news and information? And so 21, within your social network, so I just want to be very clear that that's social networks, every day or almost every day we're 21%, and at least once a week, 17%. And I thought that was really interesting. Whereas, so you have these people who are, I would say, more consumers. If you look at the groundswell sort of ladder, they're the ones, the creators, the curators, and then you have sort of the they're more of the lookers, that they're not really doing anything, but they're looking at social media and not really sharing. But the news and public information, 47% said they rarely or never share information with others in their social networks. So then we wanted to find out, well, why is that? Why do people rarely or never share information? So then if they answered yes to rarely or never, then it took them to what we call skip logic, to another question that said, why do you not share that? And 38% say the reason they don't share news with others in social network is because they rarely log into those networks or use them. Other reasons why, noted by at least 1/4 of respondents, is this kind of sounds like my dad, but it's no one's business what news they consume, was at 29%. They are unsure of the accuracy, is 27%, and they don't want to start an argument with their friends and followers, is 27%. So I thought that was really interesting with the skew of that. But what we also asked is that we also asked about if they have any behaviors that have been impacted by the disinformation and misinformation. And 3 in 10 Americans that we surveyed said they avoid the news because of the amount of disinformation, which is really interesting. And additionally, 24% say they are more likely to read sources outside the US because of the amount of disinformation in the US, which is also really interesting as well. But like I said, these are just some of the questions that we asked. I think the one that's really concerning, though, is the people who said they avoid watching or listening to the news, because then you wonder, how they're getting their information. Okay, I think that's the end of the data, and I'm happy to take questions. There are some out here. Terry did put a link to the 10 Ways to Combat Misinformation. I got that title right. Yay, Tina. So Patricia asked, do I think that TV percentage would be lower now that more has opened up? I think compared to last year, Patricia, the numbers were pretty comparable in terms of where they get their news of information. We didn't really see a significant difference there. And then there's also a question by Karen that said, you mentioned defining misinformation and disinformation for the participants. Did you give a definition of news? I wonder if people are misperceiving what is news. Do we mean information from an org that is clearly a news org? So Karen, one of the ways that we asked that question is we specifically said, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming specifically from the news. What we did is give sort of an or response. We said news or misleading information. So it could even be, it doesn't necessarily have to source from the news. It could source from other places. And the reason why we deliberately said it that way, misleading information, and make it a little more general, is because people may debate specifically what news is. So if you have something from QAnon, right, is that news? No, but it's definitely misleading information. So that's why we sort of gave it the or. Let's see. Oh, Stephanie, that's a great question. Has anyone on your team looked at disinformation visuals? We have not. We have not specifically looked at visuals, but there is an article that we featured in our research letter a few weeks ago that did talk about information and persuasiveness of visual communication. And right now we're sort of beefing up our website and reviewing sort of tags and categories that we have. And one of the areas that we will have in our BERC, our Behavioral Insights Research Center, is one specifically about visuals. But what's really interesting, though, is not to get too much into disinformation, but there is a lot of great research out there about the persuasiveness of visuals and how you put some certain information, and if it's emotional or rational in the visuals, and how that makes a difference. Okay, I'm going to try to weave through here these studies. Let's see. Outright lies from sources who hold authority, are they considered disinformation? Yes. So I think the key here, this is what Miles Cote asked. Outright lies, say that 3 times fast, from sources who hold authority, are they considered disinformation? Yes. So if you have a source who tells you, and it's a very credible source, you know, if it's someone in government or an actor, actress, or someone who's well known in any sort of sphere, and they say an outright lie, then that is disinformation. Now, you can get technical and say, well, you know, well, maybe they don't know it is, but I would venture that they do know that what they're saying is deliberately misleading or false, and that would be classified as disinformation. Now, if someone stood up and said something that was incorrect, but not necessarily deliberately misleading to fool people, then that would be just classified under misinformation. And it's not that we want to get too nuanced with that, because I mean, misinformation, disinformation is still incorrect information, and it doesn't get a pass depending on who the sender is. But I think the intent does play a role. You're doing a great job. What we'll do is we will send out the webinar to everybody at the end when it's concluded for playback. But I know you don't want to watch this again. But what Nikki, our wonderful comms marketing manager, Nikki, she can send out the sources that Terry has included in the Q&A section, so we have it. Oh, hi, Ron. So Ron O'Brien said, given the rise in conspiracy theories, do you think this is considered disinformation or entertainment? From my perspective, 100% disinformation, because people will adopt these sources. And there's a really interesting article, Terry, there's a really interesting article that's coming out tomorrow in our research letter. And it's all about, it's fascinating, but it's all about differences between Republicans and Democrats in terms of how they perceive fake news and their need for structure. And what that means is that people have an easier time saying that, and this, you can all disagree with this, people have an easier time with saying that the media is deliberately misleading than they do with saying that the media is publishing something that's correct, but it doesn't fit my worldview. So there's interesting research about people's need and desire for structure and that sort of rationality and their perception of fake news and information that doesn't align with their beliefs. But yeah, I would say it is disinformation. I mean, even The Onion, which is clearly entertainment, people still, if I have a friend who posts the Onion article, you'll still see people comment that they think it's real. And they're like, this is satire, which I don't know what satire means, but you get my point. But yeah, I do see some, the conspiracy theories is out of control. And that also shows, I feel like I'm a Burke promotion, but Burke also there were a couple of great articles we published during COVID about, and it's also on our COVID-19 Resource Center, that looks at people's willingness to believe conspiracy theories, you know, that Bill Gates created this because he wants to like kill people with vaccines. I mean, just like really insane stuff, but how well do people believe that and whether it fits with their worldview? All right, let's see. Alan says he wants to determine Pierre's fraternity for fake news. I think, Alan, I think that's a good point. I think it's really hard to do because like I said, people don't understand what PR practitioners do. And if you say PR practitioner or they work in comms, people would have different viewpoints based on what that is. Oh, hi, Lucas. Nice to see you on here. Oh, just see, there's I have to read this carefully. So Lucas is asking about the details of the report. Oh, he says, he seems even more concerning for the field that we are considered culpable for spreading disinformation, that the belief that we should be very responsible for combating it. In general, we are the actor and the other a desired defender of good information. I think it's concerning for everyone, Lucas, PR included, that people do expect us to do more to help protect people or call out disinformation. So I think part of it's us being you know, good, I would say, stewards for ourselves in the profession, and also making sure that we are taking steps to combat it. not to be overly, I'm not trying to criticize our profession because I absolutely love PR and comms. But I think sometimes we sort of go along for the ride of whatever the issues of the day are. So rather than taking like a very critical look to what would be most beneficial for our profession. And I'm not trying to say this, the example that I'm giving, and it's probably not the best example, is like purpose. When people all of a sudden start talking about purpose, everything's purpose, without saying, all right, let's take a step back and say what is needed and how can our profession best contribute to that. But that's just my perspective. Don't quote IPR on that. Lucas, what would probably be helpful? I don't have it right in front of me. If you can just copy this question and email me, and then I'm happy to look at it. So Teresa asked if age was a factor in any of the respondents about the perceptions. I mean, it was in a very minor way, because we did, for example, we did look at age. We looked at like military service, marriage, suburban, urban, rural, other sorts of, if they're pro-Trump, against Trump, in addition to being liberal, conservative, that ideology, in addition to if they voted in the last election. So there's all these great demographics that we have in crosstabs. I'm also more than happy to share any data or any of the crosstabs if anyone's curious and taking a closer look. While there were just some age differences, we just didn't, they weren't as significant as the political affiliation. I hope you guys can hear my stomach growl on this webinar. I should have eaten something today. All right, so Carol said, what's the role of data from research in making information more believable, or do people also not trust data? So Carol, I think this is a really good question. This is a really good question, and it all has to do, I think it also has to do with us being really good consumers of research. There were, and it's about, and so we do our research boot camp to teach people how to be good consumers of research. Because, for example, people can have any sort of data points they want, but if the sample was skewed, if the questions that were asked were skewed, it affects the overall study no matter what data you collect. So those sort of points, what I would advise everybody to do if they can, before they share research or share any sort of findings, that you look at the samples and you say, okay, they did a sample of 115 students. If it's in comms, which is skewed, therefore we're not going to publish this. Or I would say just to know that this is a student sample and it's a low sample size. I mean, if you have a sample size of 115 people, you're talking about a margin of error at about plus or minus 10%, which means if the number is 50%, that means that the true number of the population lies between 40% and 60%. So, I mean, that can really skew data. So I think it's a matter of how many people were collected in the sample, and also how were the questions asked, and how that plays a big role too, because that can skew. So I think it's also becoming a trusted information source, that you're making sure when you are sharing research that it is buttoned up and really tight. And that way you become sort of a trusted resource of information. So someone asked who's most believed, male, female spokespersons. We didn't ask that or study it. There's a lot of research out there about credibility of spokespersons, and even not even just being male versus female, but charismatic versus non-charismatic. Oh, hi, Jill, one of our great trustees. So Jill asked a question. She said, can you talk a bit more about trusted info from employers? What did this study show in this area? So Jill, they didn't overly register, like my employer didn't register as something significant in any place. What I will say is that they didn't find them as being as responsible for having to take on some of the burden of disinformation, or that but overall, I mean, my employer, they weren't as trusted as maybe some other sources, but they weren't distrusted either. There was a low number of people who said they did not trust their employer. And I think that's a really interesting distinction, because when you ask people about CEOs' businesses, right, people see this as there's this hierarchy where people are sitting at this top of this business. Versus when you ask about their specific employer, that's more personal to them, and they may view their employer very differently than they do what they consider businesses, CEOs, marketers, advertisers, and these sort of more vague, sources that they may not understand. But yes, and Jill, I'm more than happy to dig in and send you some of the information as well. But what we did see, by the way, from our studies in COVID, not specifically about disinformation, but when we asked people about trusted sources and who they trusted, employers were one of the most trusted sources, in addition to federal agencies. And what I remember from the COVID study is that the least trusted sources were social media, the federral government, I remember those two, social media and federal government, were like the least trustworthy, specifically for COVID. Anonymous asked about the influences of family friends on information disinformation. Family friends, just like last year, they were always rated high to the top as people who were the most trusted sources. But they weren't as responsible for spreading disinformation compared to other sources, nor were they as responsible for combating disinformation. However, people like me were responsible for combating disinformation. And just to note, I mean, people like me, I should be in that boat as well. So I'm thinking maybe people take some responsibility. Awesome, Lisa, thanks for your compliment. Oh, hi, Nance. I love seeing all these familiar names. Did you study any additional growing visibility and the damage they do to society at large? We did not specifically ask about conspiracy theories. I think from my academic sense, that I think conspiracy theories are also sort of up to the whoever's engaging in them. So I may see a conspiracy theory as the Bill Gates or the 5G or Pizzagate or something like that. But on the other hand, you know, some other person may see conspiracy theories as complete opposite to that, right? And how people define conspiracy theories. I will say, though, that we do have a couple in the Burke Center. If you go to Misinformation, Disinformation, there is some interesting research there. But it's in our COVID-19 Resource Center. You can go to research, and COVID-19, I think, is the first drop-down menu that comes up. There's a really great article on there about why people share conspiracy theories and why people believe in conspiracy theories. And that's a great article to read. There's all sorts of personality that makes people more susceptible to sharing conspiracy theories. That's really fascinating, I think, overall. Let's see. So Clark said, it's interesting to know the consolidation of local TV news by media companies and how they sought to influence a national point of view on local listeners. So yes, so Clark, one of the issues, and I think when we talked about Dr. Abernathy's research, is with the news deserts, but one of the agglomerations like Sinclair, these local news broadcasters. I'm from originally from Pensacola, Florida, and we have like Sue Strawn, who's still, you know, I haven't lived there in 20, oh God, how old am I? 25 years, but she's still on there, and she's like a fixture in the community. So if she says something, or Dave, at this time it's Dave Daughtry, says something, they're more likely to be believed than if it's some other sort of pundit or talking head that maybe you don't align with, right? And we see that today with some of the sources that people do believe and they do trust, regardless if you're a Democrat or Republican, the local news. Were there differences in opinions, beliefs of college-educated versus non-college educated respondents? I can't recall right off the hand, Miles, if there were. But if they were, they weren't necessarily significant enough for us to include in the report, because we did go through a look at differences, and there could be differences, but and I'm more than happy to share with you the crosstabs, but they weren't as significant as Democrats and Republicans. So Nance says, did you consider as part of the study that people in our communication can use to determine misinformation? No, we have fact checkers and whether they're reliable or whether they use fact checkers, or should fact checkers combat disinformation and the trustworthy. And the fact checkers, and we put in parentheses like Snopes and PolitiFact and some of the others, that they did believe those to be, not everybody, but credible. So Mary Miller, hi Mary, says, related to Clark's comment, I think it has a huge impact on the reliability of the data related to local broadcast news. Sinclair has to be impacting that, and consumers will not even be aware of it. Yes, I agree with you completely. I mean, I'm sure if you ask an average local broadcast TV news consumer if they're aware of Sinclair and their affiliation and how they're purchasing stations, they would probably say no. And even if they did know Sinclair, they wouldn't necessarily know Sinclair. So yes, but from our standpoint, same thing what we did with the PR professionals question, we do specifically just ask them about the perception of that target audience. So yes, we got through a lot of questions. That's great. I'm so excited that everyone had so many great questions for this. This was really fantastic. And I appreciate each and every one of you taking the time. Oh, hi, Greg. Greg Clark's not here, sorry, I love Greg. But I appreciate each and every one of you taking the time. I appreciate Terry sharing all the insights about PERC. And this is a really important study. And if you want to follow up with me or ask questions about it, my email address is Tina. Oh, hi, Mike. Charenson's on here too. At Institute, or Tina at instituteforpr.org. I'm happy to share crosstabs if you want to dig into it more. I'm happy if anyone wants me to talk to anyone about this, I'm happy to as well. So this is I got to turn over to Nikki. And also big shout out to Nikki. She runs our webinars and she's just really fantastic. And actually just shout out to the whole IPR team, Olivia, Sarah, Jasmine, Erica, Brittany. They're all really fantastic and they do a great job at putting these webinars together and just also putting together all these resources that we have on our website are thanks a lot to the IPR team. We always say we're small, but we're mighty. So, all right. I'm turning over to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Tina. So if anyone else has any other questions, you can email them in to us. So this marks the end of the IPR webinar. The playback will be made available later today, so please check back for that. I'll also email it out to you all, along with the links that Terry shared, along with some other ones that we'll share. Please visit our website at instituteforpr.org for the latest research, as well as the disinformation study. We depend on you to help sponsor these webinars, so if you'd like to make a donation to IPR, you may do so on our website as well. Thanks everyone, thanks Tina, and have a great day.